Thank you. It's great to be back with you again, and Happy New Year to you as well from us. We're doing well back in Texas. Very thankful for just the ministry that God has allowed us to be a part of. Our enrollments have been full. Wonderful group of Bible college students that are with us, and blessed in our family. We had a great Christmas together with all the kids and 9 grandkids, so very, very blessed. I'm going to be looking this morning with us at 1 Kings chapter 12. And so if you will turn to there, at this point in Israel's history, Solomon has passed away, and his son Rehoboam is on the throne. He's 41 years old, and he is taking over the most prosperous part of Israel's history that they ever had. It's just been an amazing time of prosperity, of blessing. And yet the downside is that during all that time, Solomon has been gradually moving more and more into idolatry. You remember, he let all of his foreign wives build shrines and idols, worship places to their gods that they worshiped. And so they've reintroduced into Israel the gods of the Canaanite people. And some of those gods are worshiped by human sacrifice. And again, I think I've said before, there's no record that Solomon permitted those, that he did not permit human sacrifice during his reign, but he opened the door. And in future generations, Israel will move into that, and it'll be one of the principal reasons that God will have them dispersed off of the land. Let me just begin in prayer, and then we'll jump into 1 Kings 12. God, I thank you so much again for your word and for your life. Thank you, God, for your dealings with us, always in grace and truth. And I pray that as we look at your word, God, we just would understand what you have for us, and that we would know your grace, God, for incorporating these things and for you working them into our lives, and that we would be living in accord with the truth for your honor and glory. In Christ's name, amen. I'm reminded in looking at Rehoboam here in chapter 12 that in Ecclesiastes 2:18, Solomon said, "Thus I hated all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who must come after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool? Yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity." Well, as it turned out, his son, Rehoboam, did play the fool. We're told that when he became king, he decided to have his official coronation ceremony in the city of Shechem. And Shechem was in the territory of Manasseh, and it was only 40 miles north of Jerusalem. The reason that he's chosen this place, we think, is because it wasn't in Judah, but it's in another tribe, Manasseh. And Manasseh and Ephraim, you remember, were the 2 sons of Joseph, and they were the 2 tribes that represented the double blessing that Joseph got. And because they were Joseph's heirs, and Joseph was the designated heir of the house, he was the one that received the double blessing, they've kind of always thought of themselves as the most privileged tribes, that they were the big deal, not Judah. And so there's been a long, ongoing, simmering resentment on the part of Ephraim and Manasseh toward Judah. Rehoboam would have known that. And so he chooses to have his coronation in the territory of Manasseh, and it would seem because he's trying to appease the people. But there's nothing that he can do that's going to be adequate. At least this is not adequate. And so he just, I think, really underestimates how bad the rift is between Judah and the rest of the tribes of Israel, largely because of his father and things that he had done. And so it says in verse 2, it came about that when Jeroboam the son of Nebat heard about the coronation of Rehoboam, that he came up from where he had been in Egypt, because Solomon had threatened to kill him, and he had fled to Egypt, and now he's back. And so the people come to Rehoboam in verse 4 and say, "Your father made our yoke hard. Therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you." And this is very reasonable, and all they're asking for is that the taxes be reduced. Solomon saw so much wealth come into Israel during his 40 years of reign that there was no reason for taxation whatsoever. But he was not content with that amount of money. Billions of dollars literally in gold were coming in every year, but it wasn't enough. And so he was taxing the people. And in fact, he divided up the entire nation into 12 districts, and each district was responsible for providing a month's provision for the throne. And so all the food they needed, all the wine they drank, all the provisions, every one of the 12 sections of Israel was responsible for providing that for 1 month of the year. And that in itself was a big burden, but he taxed the people excessively even beyond that. He could get away with it because it was such a prosperous time. And by the way, one tribe was left out of the 12 divisions, and that was his own tribe of Judah. So Judah was being exempted from this tax burden that the rest of the nation had to live under. We can kind of see in our own day how sometimes privileged families in politics seem to be exempt from the laws that they're coming up with. And that's how it was at this time. And so the people came and they said, your dad is dead. All of this money that's been coming in, billions in gold, has stopped. The taxes are way too high now. You need to lower the taxes. We will serve you if you do this. Reasonable request. And so he said in verse 5, depart from me for 3 days and then return. So he's got 3 days to seek counsel on this matter. So verse 6, King Rehoboam consulted with the elders who had served his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, how do you counsel me to answer this people? Now this is a smart move on Rehoboam's part. He's going to the men, the elders who served Solomon. Now, if you're serving the smartest man who ever lived, you're probably pretty bright yourself. And so he goes to these old gray-haired guys and say, what do you counsel me to do? And they spoke with one voice, verse 7, saying, if you will be a servant to this people today, will serve them, grant them the petition, and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. Do what they're saying. Verse 8, without hearing any other counsel, he forsook the counsel of the elders which they had given him, and he consulted with the young men who grew up with him and served him. Now he's displaying his folly. 3 days to think about what they had requested, that was smart. But without even hearing anyone else's advice, he forsakes what the elders said. He didn't like it. So that tells us on the face, he was never seeking advice. He was seeking affirmation. He was never seeking counsel. He's seeking confirmation. And when he heard what he didn't like, he rejects it out of hand. Turns to the young men who grew up with him and said, what counsel do you give me? Saying to these people who said to me, lighten the yoke which your father put on us. Verse 10, the young men who grew up with him spoke to him, saying, thus you shall say to this people who spoke to you, saying, your father made our yoke heavy. Now you make it lighter for us. But you shall speak to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Whereas my father loaded you with a heavy yoke, I will add your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, I will discipline you with scorpions. And he liked that. Sounded tough. Sounded strong. So verse 12, then Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, and as the king had directed, saying, return to me on the third day. And the king answered the people harshly, for he forsook the advice of the elders which they had given to him, and he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. Sad. And that resulted in the division of the country, never to be united again. 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin to the south, 10 tribes with Jeroboam to the north, and now we have 2 nations, Israel to the north and Judah to the south. God knew that this was going to happen, and he set the stage for Jeroboam to take over. He prophesied to Jeroboam that this was going to take place and that he would become king over 10 tribes. But it was all unnecessary and wouldn't have happened if Rehoboam, first if Solomon had sought the Lord and continued to seek the Lord, and if Rehoboam had done the same. I look at the life of Rehoboam, and I think there's a few lessons here with him. It's always tempting to want to be strong, to take the strong posture. And we hate weakness. We get older and our bodies start to break down. We don't like it. I don't like wearing hearing aids. That day came quite a while ago. And just the different things that happen to us, we don't like weakness in ourselves. And if we're honest, we really don't like weakness in others. And yet this is exactly what the people are asking. Rehoboam thinks. They're asking him to be weak. And the elders are saying, serve these people and they will serve you. And that appears to be weakness to Rehoboam. And as a young man, he's not willing to come across weak. He wants to be strong and to present himself as strong. I remember when I was in Bible college, I was an RA my senior year, and there was a professor there who was up for tenure, and he was a young professor, department head, very popular with the students and especially with some of the guys and particularly the seniors. And he ran with us, lifted weights with us. We were frequently in his home. We were on a first-name basis with him, and he was the only professor like that. So he's quite popular. So when he was eligible for tenure and it wasn't given to him, he was quite upset. Now, all faculty members at most universities, they sign a statement saying that they will never complain publicly to the students or anyone else outside the university about internal affairs. Well, this professor broke that covenant, and he did complain to some of the students that he was close to. So we were all pretty fired up about it. Now, I have a pretty high sense of justice already, and so I don't need much encouragement to jump into somebody else's business. And so a bunch of the guys in the dorm, they came to me and they said, Charlie, this is what's happening. And, yeah, I've heard about it. And they said, you're an RA, so you know the president of the university. You're the guy, Charlie, you need to go down to the president, make an appointment, and tell him how wrong this is. Speak for all of us. And they were just charging me up. Do it, Charlie. Yeah, do it. And so it felt right. And because I'm a high sense of justice, I think, man, yeah. And so I marched down to the president's office, and I said, I'd like to make an appointment to see the president. And his assistant said, well, he's a busy man. It'll take you 2 or 3 weeks. And I said, well, put me down. And so it was a 15-minute slot. Meantime, spring break came up. And so I went home. And as was my custom when I was home, there was an old retired missionary guy, about 600-700 years old. And I would go and I would visit with him in his home every time I was there. And I remember sitting in his modest home, and his wife was getting dinner ready for us, and he was asking me about university and what was going on and so I told him about this situation and with this grave injustice that was happening, and I was going to speak to the president of the university when I got back from spring break. And this dear old saint, he just closes his eyes, puts his head down on his chest, and I'm thinking, nap time? And I was just so clueless. And he wasn't napping, he was praying. And he was pretty fired up, would have never known it. But he just, after a bit, he raised his head, opened his eyes, and said, Charles, spoke very slowly, deliberately, when I was a young man in university, no student would have made an appointment with the president of the university for any reason whatsoever. And he didn't even say it as strongly as I just said it. And I felt like I'd been run through with a sword. And I knew exactly what he was saying. Who do you think you are? Humble yourself. And so I went back after spring break, and I kept my appointment with the president, but I never brought up that matter. Never brought it up. Years later, that professor who left the school because he didn't get tenure happened to be in San Antonio, and I asked him out for lunch. And I brought up what had happened. I said, do you remember when you didn't get tenure? And boy, he jumped on it. And surprisingly, he said what I did not expect to hear. And he said, that godly man made a decision that I did not want made at the time and didn't understand it. But if he had not done what he did, I would not be doing what I'm doing today. And I thank God for that man and how God used him in my life. And I'm sitting there thinking, I am so glad I kept my mouth shut. It appears strength when in fact sometimes the strongest posture is simply to humble ourselves before God. I'll tell you another story. When I was about, I guess, 8 years old, I was out dove hunting with my grandfather and father. That's a big deal in South Texas. And my grandfather was in his late 70s, blind in one eye, tunnel vision in the other, but he was the best dove shot I've ever seen in my life. And I was his bird dog. So when you have grandkids, you don't need dogs, you just use the grandsons. And so I would sit next to his lawn chair out in the field, and he would say, Charlie, you tell me where the birds are coming from and I'll shoot them, because he couldn't see them till they're right on him. And so I'd point them out. Here comes one, Pop. And he'd shoot it, and I'd run out there and pick up the bird, bring it back, and he'd pat me on the head, good boy, and I'd sit back down in the dirt again. I was a good bird dog. Well, I ran out and picked up a bird one time, and there was a hunter across the field with a 12-gauge shotgun shooting at a bird that was flying low to the ground. And bluey, and on the third bluey, he shot me. And I got hit right in the chest with one of the pellets. Well, I'd never been shot before. So I went over to my grandfather and I said, Pop, I've been shot. And he says, what do you mean? And show me. And I opened up my shirt and there was one drop of blood in the middle of my chest. By golly, you have been shot. Called my dad over. Porter, Charlie's been shot. Show me. Still had the drop of blood. Who did that? And I pointed to the man across the field. Stay here. And he walked over there. He ends up picking the guy up and throwing him across the hood of the car. And my dad's not a big man. And this guy was head and shoulders bigger than my dad. And was climbing up to hit him. And the guy waved him off. And so he came back. And my dad said, he's not going to shoot you anymore. And my grandfather patted me on the head. And I thought, wow. And the whole point there of the story is I was so impressed with my dad because of his strength. Little boys like that. My dad's a strong dad. Well, it wasn't very long after that, I came home from school one day and there was an official notice stapled to our front door. I couldn't read most of it, but I understood this property auctioned 60 days. And I'm thinking, what is that about? So when my dad came home, he told us, we don't own this home, we rent it. And the man who owns it has gotten in trouble with the bank. And the bank is taking the property back. We have 60 days to buy the property or move out. Well, my dad was working in the oil business. He's a geologist, and he was on 100% commission selling oil prospects, and he hadn't sold anything in a long time. We're eating beans and rice. And now he's got to buy a house. Now, I never saw my dad pray except at a mealtime. We went to church every Sunday, but that was basically the extent of our faith. 30 days go by, 40 days go by, 50 days go by, and we don't have a house to go to. And he's not able to pay for our house. We're about to be on the street. 6 kids. And my dad brought us all into the living room and said, get out on your knees. Well, that's never happened before. And we're all on our knees. And my dad, same man who threw a man across the hood of a car, is looking at us 6 kids and saying, there is nothing I can do. I've done everything that can be done. And unless God helps us, we're going to be on the streets in 10 days. We must cry out to God. And so the 8 of us cried out to God. Now, which do you think made a bigger impact on my life? Seeing my dad in his strength or seeing my dad in his weakness cry out to God? Rehoboam never saw his dad cry out to God. Never. All he saw from his dad for the 41 years of his life was strength on display. One of the reasons I say that is because Solomon spent that 40 years multiplying wives. 700 wives and 300 concubines. And remember what that represents? Power. One wife represents weakness. Multiple wives represents power. And all he'd seen from his dad his entire life was a man who might have with lip service saying, God is my trust, but in his actions was saying, I am the reason for what you see in this kingdom. He was taking credit for everything that happened in Israel by virtue of multiplying those wives. Because it is clear in the Bible that multiplication of wives has to do with strength. Weak men don't have multiple wives. Powerful men do. I think I may have mentioned another time when I was here, what really brought that home to me one time was we had a student with us at His Hill from Togo, West Africa, and we were talking about polygamy. And the students were giving all the wrong answers for what is the basis for polygamy. And this guy from West Africa is just getting angry. I can just see it. He's sitting on the front row and I can see it's just steam's coming out of his ears. And I said to him, you seem a little agitated. Why? Does your father happen to have more than one wife? And I knew that he did. And he says, yes, my father has 5 wives. And the students are just, oh. And I go, why? And with no hesitation, he says, because my father is a big man. He is a powerful man. That's why he has 5 wives. And when Rehoboam sees a father with 700 wives, more than any man in the world, he's had presented to him his entire life that kings are powerful people. And they don't yield to anybody. They don't serve anybody. They are here to be served. David spent his life serving Israel. Solomon spent his life being a celebrity. And there is a huge difference. I'm reminded of the words of Scripture that says, but Jesus called them to himself and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. And I could go on with verses like that. I think about the book of James, where it says the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good works, unwavering, without hypocrisy. That old saint, when I sat in his home and told him about confronting the president of the school, his words were not harsh. He never raised his voice. Gentle, reasonable words. One of my biggest regrets in life is the many times that I have lost my temper with people. Everything I said may have been right. Didn't regret what I said, but regretted how I said it. The wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits. Rehoboam spoke harshly to the people, refused to take the weak posture. There's an application here. Maybe I'm stretching it a bit. I hope not. When I approach God, how many times I know probably all of us have been guilty of going before the Lord and approaching Him with our request. And we really are wanting Him to do our bidding. And we're wanting Him to solve our problems. And we've already made up our mind when we go to Him in prayer of what He ought to do. And so we tell Him what He ought to do. Lord, heal. Lord, provide. Lord, protect. Valid prayers. Nothing wrong with those prayers. But there can be a demandingness in them. And I have discovered over the years, and I've too often failed to come back to this, that many times I feel like that I have not prayed through a matter until I can honestly say, your will be done. Your will be done, not mine. Yes, Lord, I'd like to see protection, provision, whatever it is, healing. But until I have come to that place of being able to say, thy will be done, not mine, I don't feel that I've truly prayed through a matter. And somehow when you get to that place of, Lord, it's your will, it's not mine, everything's okay. It truly is. And we can know the joy of the Lord regardless of the outcome, because we're confident that God's will is being done. Rehoboam approached those elders like we approach God. He wanted to hear from the elders what he wanted to hear. And when they weren't willing to give what he wanted to hear, he just turned right around to the young men and got what he wanted to hear. That is not how we are to live this life before the Lord. Now I want to move on to Jeroboam. We're skipping a little bit here, but still in chapter 12, verse 25. Jeroboam becomes king. And it says that he built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim. He lived there, and he went out from there, and he built Penuel, so 2 capital cities, basically. And then Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will return to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices to the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will be returned to their Lord, even to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. Now this is not even true, because God said in chapter 11, He spoke by prophet to Jeroboam and said, God is going to make you king, and if you walk in his ways and obey him, he will establish your house forever, just like David. So the same thing that God has done for David, Jeroboam, he was prepared to do for you. And so when Jeroboam says, if I don't do something to keep the people here and not going down to Jerusalem to worship, then I will lose the hearts of the people and they will kill me, it's not even true. It is a baseless fear. He is thinking like the world and not thinking according to what God said. Now, if I had a map of Israel, but you know Israel well enough, you know that there is a northern border, mountains. There is a southern border, desert. There is a western border, the Mediterranean Ocean, and there is an eastern border, the Jordan Sea. But going east to west across the middle of Israel, there is no border. There's no mountain range, there's no river. And so the distinction geographically between north and south in Israel is the same geographical distinction between Canada and the United States. Nothing. It's the 49th parallel. It's an imaginary line on a map. And that's all the distinction you have geographically between Judah and Israel. And so Jeroboam's thinking, I've got a problem here. We've got a people with the same history, the same language, and the same religion. I can't do anything to change their language overnight. I can't change their history overnight. And I like to tongue-in-cheek say, unless I'm a Democrat. But the one thing I can change is their religion. And so that's what he sets out to do. And he's very clever here. He goes, I will not have their loyalty unless I have their hearts. And I will not have their hearts unless I can influence their worship. And that is an amazing insight that he has. That loyalty is influenced by heart, and heart is influenced by worship. And so I don't think that Jeroboam is this smart. I think that Satan is inspiring this guy to do what he's doing. It was totally unnecessary. And yet he says, if I influence their worship, I can influence their hearts, I'll influence their loyalty. So he says, I got to do something about their worship. So he comes up with the scheme to have 2 golden calves, one in the town of Bethel, the other in the town of Dan. Dan was in the far north, Bethel was in the far south. Lots of villages in the north, lots of villages in the south. Why did he choose those 2? Now, I haven't read any commentaries on this, so maybe I'm out of hand with it. I don't think so. But when you look at these villages across the south and the ones across the north, and he chooses Bethel. Why Bethel? I think both of these have been strategically and purposefully chosen because of their history. Because what he's going to say, and look at this, his justification for introducing these idols, these golden calves, is in verse 28. So the king consulted and made 2 golden calves, and he said to them, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, O Israel, that brought you up from the land of Egypt. So what's his justification? It's too much. It's inconvenient. It's too costly. Surely there's a better way. So he's offering them a worship that costs them less. It appeals to their sense of convenience. That becomes his justification. Now, why these two cities? Why would they go along with this? I think he knows that Dan and Bethel will be more receptive of this than any other villages in Israel. Why? Well, Bethel, crazy. You remember Bethel is that place that Jacob spent the night when he ran away from his brother Esau. Very first place he spent the night. And it wasn't called Bethel originally, it was called Luz. But it was at this place, Luz, that in the night he has a vision and he sees angels ascending and descending from heaven. Recall that? And this is what Jacob said later in Genesis 28:16. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it. How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. And he called the place Bethel, house of God. Previously it was called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow. If God will be with me and keep me, and I return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord shall be my God. Now, I am in no position to tell you whether or not Jacob was saved when he uttered those words. I know some people would say that he was, other people would say that he was not. But I can tell you those were not spiritual, mature words. If anything, this is carnality. And it sure sounds like he may not even have known the Lord fully yet. Who knows? But this I know, there was nothing special about that place. Nothing special about that location. Wherever he had spent the night, God would have appeared to him. It had nothing to do with the dirt where he laid down that night. Surely the Lord is in this place. How awesome is this place? No, it had nothing to do with the place. When Moses had God appear to him in a burning bush, he didn't say, "What an awesome bush. Surely this is the greatest bush I've ever seen in my life." No, because Moses knew it had nothing to do with the bush. And God appearing to Jacob had nothing to do with where he spent the night. But he said, this is the house of God. This place is different from every other place. And for generations now, hundreds of years, the people have bought into it. And so there is a superstition that is attached to this place. There is already a corrupted worship to this place. And Jeroboam knew it. And that's why he said, let's start out with Bethel. Because they have been so corrupted by their superstitious thought, they'll be easier to move a little further into corruption. There is no place for superstition in a Christian's life. Even to think that a church is a holier place, this building is a holier place than some other place, is a superstition. I remember a guy called me up one time, and he said, "Charlie, I received Christ as a camper at His Hill." I think he said he was like 8 or 9 years old. And he says, "And I walked away from the Lord when I was in college. I'm 30 years old now, and I need to get back on track with Jesus. I know I do. And I just know that if I can come back to His Hill and be a Bible college student, that I can get back on track with the Lord." And I said to him, quoting from another person, "It only takes a moment to get off track with the Lord. And it only takes a moment to get back on track with the Lord. You don't need His Hill. Right now, you can turn back to Jesus and start over where you are, and He will take you where you are. You don't need this place to get back on track with the Lord. Turn to Jesus. Turn to Jesus. That's what you need to do. The place doesn't matter." But the people of Bethel thought they lived in a special place. Not so. What about Dan? Dan was not supposed to be where Dan was. God, through Joshua, didn't give Dan a northern territory. He gave them a western territory on the Mediterranean Sea, roughly where present-day Gaza is. That's supposed to be Dan's territory. That was the territory of the Philistines. But they never had the faith to take that land. And so they lived in their tents outside their own territory. And after a period of time, they got tired of living in the tents. I imagine the wives were complaining more than a little bit. How long am I going to live in this tent? Do something about it. And so the men got on their horses, and they went looking, and they found this little place up in the northern part. Beautiful place. If you've ever been to Israel and you go up there, it's just beautiful. And they go, this is beautiful, and it's unprotected. The people living here don't have any alliances with anyone else to help them. This is easy. Philistines, that's hard. Easier, more convenient to take that land. And so they took it. Along the way, they found a priest, a Levite, who was serving as a priest to a man who had idols. And they said to that guy, after they robbed the idols, they said, you can be a priest to a single man, or you can be a priest to a tribe. Totally against the law. Because a Levite was not to function as a priest to a man or to a tribe. And you had to be of the priestly line to function as a priest. Wasn't enough simply to be a Levite. So everything about what Dan did was based on convenience. Is it any wonder that all these years later, Jeroboam says, we'll put one of those calves in Dan? What does that tell us? The spiritual decisions we're making now are leaving a legacy for generations to come. That doesn't mean that all the generations to come are going to walk with the Lord. But I know none of us can fully appreciate the impact that our lives make on our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and even beyond that, when we choose to walk with the Lord in faith. I never knew my great-grandfather, but not long ago, I found out that I knew he was a farmer in East Texas, farmed a section of land outside of a little town called San Augustine, East Texas. And he knew the Lord. I didn't know that. Had a passel of kids, one of those kids to grow up hearing the gospel, hearing the Bible preached. And so he funded, and cut out the land, from what I understand, of a Baptist church down the dirt road, a mile from where his farm was, so it's close enough they could all walk to church and all walk back again. And that Baptist church is still there today, and the cemetery out back is full of McCalls. I never knew that. Just a couple years ago, I went there with my dad and looked at that place. That was my great-grandfather. My grandfather knew the Lord, but he never shared his faith. And he didn't come to Christ until after he had been married and put a son through dental school, and then his wife divorced him. This was back in the 1920s. And he was so depressed, he walked out on the beach in Galveston Island and was going to walk out into the surf and drown himself. And he came across a crusade by Billy Sunday out on the beach. And he stood in the back and heard the gospel. Even though he'd heard it all of his life growing up in that Baptist church, he had never believed. And he stood in the back of that congregation the day that he was going to end his life, and he heard the gospel really with his heart for the first time, and he believed, and he was saved. Never shared his faith with us. It wasn't until much later that we ever heard that story. So my dad grew up in a home where basically he didn't hear the gospel, and yet he himself came to know Christ. My mom did, and it had a tremendous impact on my life and all of us and so many others as well. So even though my dad didn't know the faith of his dad and the faith of his grandfather, nonetheless, those men's lives had impacted generations to come in ways that they couldn't even have said. Jeroboam understood this, and he was capitalizing on bad spiritual decisions that had been made generations before. And I just hope that as we go through life, and I know a lot of us here are pretty gray-headed, and I would expect that you're grandparents like I am, that we just will, by faith, accept that the impact that we have, which seems so minimal, and we seem more marginalized the older we get, less important, but that we would, by faith, accept that God is doing more through our lives than we can ever know. And that we would not be the Jeroboams who are leaving a legacy of corruption, and Solomon leaving a legacy of corruption, but that we are putting the Lord first in our lives. God, there's much I want to say here, and we're about out of time, so I'll pick it up with next hour. But I really want to just start out and just capitalize on this statement. It is too much for you, O Israel. Because I would just say, and just wrapping up this hour, that is so antithetical to the Christian life. It is not our business to determine what is too much for us. That is God's business. And if my life is not yielded to the Lord, then I am living my life in my own strength. And I've come to find out that no matter what comes in my life, when I'm depending on myself rather than Jesus, it is all too much. It's all too much. But the Christian life is one of dependence upon Christ. And when I'm depending upon Him in the too much of life, I find that God gives the grace for what God has brought into my life. And then life becomes a beautiful example of what He can do rather than what I can do. I'll close this in prayer. God, I thank you so much for this time and for your word. I pray, God, that you would just minister deeply to our hearts, that we'd be encouraged and strengthened, and that we would go out from this place in the strength of your might. In Jesus' name, amen.